What's up, metal and heavy music fans? It is Flight of Icarus again with metaltrenches.com. As always, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel, like, comment if you enjoyed the video, and check out our Patreon if you're a regular listener and you want to support us financially. It is time for another edition of bands that changed my life, and one I'm always excited to share these, but yeah, I guess they're all special, so it's redundant for me to say that. In any case, we're going to talk about Lamb of God, which comes up time and time again, talking on the podcast. It's hard to come across a musician these days that is not somehow inspired by Lamb of God. And so I got into this band around 2003. I was kind of starting to transition from listening to a lot of new metal to more so kind of metalcore, post-hardcore, that kind of stuff. And I think a big piece of that really pushed me also into some heavier stuff was seeing the 11th Hour music video on the newly branded version of Headbangers Ball. They had Jamie Josta as the new host, and they just played a lot of wicked music videos. That was a big source at that time of how I was learning about new metal bands and new albums that were coming out. I would sit down and watch that as frequently as I could. I still didn't have cable at this point, but my friend did, so we'd sit in his basement and frequently put on Headbangers Ball and catch up on the latest stuff. But yeah, we were watching one day after school, and this black and white music video comes on. I believe it was the premiere, like the first time they had played it, and that riff started playing. And I remember my friend and I just went dead silent. We were just like in awestruck, total quiet, watching this video, being totally transfixed by these really bleak, dark visuals and Randy's vocals. And I was really struck too by just the gritty production of it. Because again, I had only really been listening to like a lot more sort of metalcore stuff and new metal stuff more so at that point, which has kind of a cleaner production in most cases. And so this was very rough. And I loved it, which is kind of funny. I've talked about this on various other episodes before, that album, As the Palaces Burn, is my favorite Lamb of God album, but it's famously known for its horrible production and the nightmares that they went through during the recording process. This was like Devin Townsend's sort of early production work with other bands. And there's a great documentary I highly recommend watching where they've got interviews with him and the band about the whole process, and just Devin just being mortified throughout the process with what he was given, what he had to work with. And then they like lost the masters or something went wrong with them. And so the final product is so raw and gritty because of all what I consider to be kind of like happy little accidents that was mortifying to them, but to me ended up making the kind of just best qualities of that first album on top of the amazing riffs and just consistency of it. I love how just different and ugly and vicious it sounds as a result of those things. I would say for the next 2 to 3 years, that was my most jammed album. I was listening to it on repeat over and over again. It's like the perfect length of an album too. I want to say it's like just under 40 minutes, somewhere in there, somewhere between like 35 and 40. And it's just back to front to back, incredible stuff. Every track, absolutely amazing single material. I have so many memories associated with that album as a result. And on top of that, these were like my first years like driving around. And so you better believe I was listening to that album everywhere we went. Also, for those of you who are old enough to remember, like this was back before most cars still had like CD players in them. They all had cassette players still. And so I had my Discman and that little cassette player adapter that you would plug into the cassette player, and then you'd plug that back out into the headphones jack of some sort of disc player, and you'd play the album that way. And so yeah, that that was how I spent a lot of time just burning that CD out, and it's still on my shelf. One of the earlier CDs that I like bought, probably with my own money too, because I was actually starting to work at that point. I was starting to learn guitar at that time too, so I learned the riff to Ruin. I ended up seeing them at Sounds of the Underground, which was the first year, I believe, and I think that was in 2004. I talk about this a little bit on my episode where I interviewed Chris Hornbrook from Poison the Well, and because they were there, they were on the lineup as well. Lamb of God was headlining, but Poison the Well had a slot there. I think they played right before Lamb of God, potentially, or really close to them. And yeah, just so amazing. Like, they had a huge circle pit too. That was a huge crowd, and so that was pretty killer to have a true like concert experience. I think that was one of the first like festivals I went to. Backtracked to New American Gospel and Burn the Priest. I just loved Randy's vocals. I still do to this day. Like, I love that mixture of, he's got the really deep growls, but then he was also throwing in like pig squeals and more extreme music reference points. And I think that helped me sort of segue into things like death metal and grindcore. Ashes of the Wake is a very close second favorite of mine, and just another very consistent, excellent album that I jammed quite a bit, still listen to quite a bit now. I was a little bit miffed at the cleaner production, and like, no one would argue that that album is objectively better produced than As the Palaces Burn, but I still prefer As the Palaces Burn. So it was kind of a weird transition to go from that really rough, rugged, ugly sound to this much more pristine one. But in any case, still a great album and so many great songs on it. Those two in particular, I just listened to over and over and over again, and were like defining moments in my overall album collection. Sacrament came out, and this is where my interest started to wane a little bit. It was decent. It had some really good songs on it. It's grown on me over the years, but I really wasn't into the vocal direction that the band was taking. Because again, I really like that Randy was mixing together all these more extreme styles, and here he was kind of what I saw at the time, and maybe somewhat unfairly considered to be sort of like a Phil Anselmo impression, even though people say that he was actually kind of mocking Phil in some of his lyrics and taking some shots at Pantera indirectly. I never confirmed whether that was true or not. I know that supposedly there was some beef there, but in any case, that's not important. What's important to me is that I wasn't really into the direction that he was going. And then even more so on Wrath, it just felt like a very sort of color by numbers album for me. I know some people argue with me on that to the bitter end, but it's just not an album I love. It's another one that over the years I've come to appreciate, but it's just not one that I associate like really fond memories with, nor one that I pick up regularly. So I kind of dropped off with them then, but I did get interested once more when Resolution came out. That's a really solid album. I felt like Randy was bringing back in more of the extreme influences in his vocals, and I particularly was interested in the direction that the song King Me went, 'cause it's like the symphonic version of Lamb of God. And that was like, ooh, this is cool. So that's great. I also really enjoyed Sturm Drang. Even though I wasn't big on Randy's kind of foray into clean singing, I particularly loved on that album, the heavier moments are among the heaviest they've ever done, and really brought back, even took them back to kind of like the New American Gospel days. Like the song Anthropoid is just so fucking heavy. It's so intense, and I love it for that. There's enough moments of that on that album that make it probably among my favorites of them overall. But in any case, I think Lamb of God came around at just the right time. It was just this perfectly timed bridge from the more sort of accessible riffs and melodic approach of metalcore to the more extreme genres. I also class my time listening to Devil Driver in with that same time period. I think those bands very much helped me not abandon, metalcore and nu metal and all that stuff, but they helped me also expand my horizons onto death metal, grindcore, blackened death metal, things like Behemoth, Opeth, all that stuff. I don't think I would have gotten there without that little push from Lamb of God. So that is why Lamb of God is another band that changed my life and changed my direction and boundaries as a metalhead. And I'm interested to hear in the comments what y'all's experience was with them. Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? How were your experiences different or very much the same? But that is it for me right now. Flight of Icarus signing off. Please check out these other videos if you want to see and hear more. But otherwise, I will see you in the trenches.